Someone's audio is going off very weird. It's a lot quieter now. I kind of agree with Mara's point. I guess I will look more over this later on. But I guess in terms of
Good afternoon, colleagues. You might make a start. Hope you enjoyed your lunch. Hope you were able to find some wildlife and other furry friends. We are now almost approaching 2:45, and as Zahir said before our lunch break, we are aiming to close at 4:30 today. We know that people have, other commitments and virtual meetings and so on, so our aim is to close at 4:30 today. For this afternoon's session, firstly, on behalf of Zahir and I, can I just thank everyone for their engagement this morning? We heard a very comprehensive round of views on how you see the Christmas tree, what shape it is, what colour it is, and so on. For this afternoon and for the remainder of our time together here in Colombia, Zahir and I, we would like to focus on the Christmas tree decorations. So now it is time for you to tell us how you would like to decorate the tree. In order to structure our discussion, we propose that we move through issue by issue. This is in no way prejudging the overall structure that you have all communicated to us, and therefore we will go issue by issue in no particular order. We propose that we will start with context and then move to transparency. And if there is further time this afternoon, we can move on further. So with that, I would open the floor and seek your views on what should be included in the context section. We heard, obviously lots of different ideas this morning, but what we heard was everyone wants an ambitious goal. Almost everyone mentioned the importance of context and transparency, qualitative elements, and so on. So we propose to go through like this issue by issue without prejudging the structure. In terms of context, we heard some ideas already this morning, but not everybody shared their views on context this morning. So this is our opportunity now. Can I also kindly ask that when you are delivering your suggestions, that we don't have a lot of time. So if you could refrain from all the philosophical debates, we know where you all stand. We know what the positions are. But in order for us to move forward, what we'd like is to capture your views, so that we can do some preparatory work between now and Bonn. The last thing I'll say is that please don't feel like you need to read in every single option that you've ever communicated, either through a submission or consultation or in the session. We have them all. We have them through your submissions. We have recorded all of your views. So with that, I'd like to open the floor for any views on the context section or what could be included. I see the Arab state.
Thank you, Co-Chair. Not to go in on the context side. I think we can have that discussion, of course, but we just wanted to come in quickly to ask a question to understand the process. So we provided general views on the elements. Now we're diving deep into elements themselves. So if you can give us some visibility on what you envision the process to be from this meeting to tomorrow to Bonn, how will these discussions be captured and how will the work be conducted? We would be tremendously grateful. Thank you.
No problem. So our intention, we are mandated to do iterations. We are mandated to deliver before CMA 6 a substantive framework for a draft negotiating text. We are mandated through the meetings of the ad hoc work program to develop that substantive structure for the draft negotiating text. This morning, we shared a round of views on what that structure is. So this is the start of that work. We are now mandated to progress in an iterative development of that text or of that structure. And so we have now heard your general views on the structure. Some participants and groups have included detail of what to be included, but many didn't. And so now is the time to go through element by element so that we can fill in the gaps. I see the AGN.
Thank you so much, co-chairs, and just trying to break the ice, and we might come back as AGN or as individual African countries to bring further elements there. I think like what we have in all the processes and all the outcomes of this of the process, usually you have a structure that starts with a preambular part that provides context to the rest. So I think this is an important component, and the elements there, we believe, like any other decision that we have and any other outcome that we have, would include the framing, and the framing is the relevant UFCCC, the convention, and the Paris Agreement relevant paras, and there we have mentioned before that for us the chapeau of Article 2 is very important. So our work is in the context of poverty eradication and sustainable development, and of course the guiding principles that we have all agreed to when it comes to that, which is equity and CBDR, among others. And then from there, we go to those elements that are relevant to finance, and in particular Article 4.5, which links the level of action of developing countries by the level of support provided to them. And then we go to the Article 9, very specifically 9.1 and 9.3, 9.5, and 9.7, which provides the context for the whole thing. So this is the first part, which is the relevance. And we want to have clearly reflecting the different articles, and without having a generic thing like recalling the Paris Agreement and the Convention. Now we want to be very clear on the articles because they provide the framing and they highlight the responsibility. The second element of that would be within the context, again, the outcomes that are relevant. So Glasgow, Sharm, and Dubai, and each one of them has elements that relates to the NCQG. And in particular, those among them the ones that are focusing on the implementation of the current NDCs and NAPs and the evolving needs of developing countries. With that, we add to that the elements that were highlighted before in Sharm and in Glasgow on the issue of debt, the issue of challenges facing developing countries on access, and the call that was put forward for the IFIs to work on the reform on three main pillars: increasing scale, enhancing access, working on concessional finance. So those for us are preliminary, the elements that should be included. And I think those will give this kind of preambular part when we structure the outcome as the context, you call it, preamble as you would like to call it, or the entry point for the building up to the rest of the decision and the outcome. So those are the initial thoughts, and as we highlighted them also in the opening statement, but other colleagues from the African group can complement that. We'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mo. If there are no further interventions on the context, Australia, followed by the EU, followed by Colombia.
Thank you. And I love a sense of urgency to get everyone moving after a long lunch. I feel like we can get a little lethargic. So I appreciate that. Thank you, Fiona. It's interesting because my understanding of context maybe is slightly different to what Mo's was. So it could be useful for us to have a discussion as to the terminology we're using and how we understand it. I would understand a lot of the recollection of articles and sort of mandates for decision to fall into the preamble. But again, context, preamble, they could ultimately be merged together. I'm going to focus more on what I understand to be potentially a context element in the decision text. But do recognize that if there was to be a preamble, we would want to see all the relevant, of course, articles and mandates referenced there, of course, 2.1c, Article 9.3, Decision 1, CP 21. We could list these all day, and I'm happy to pop those in writing as well. But I think they've all been mentioned in previous TEDs, so they're in the options paper really already, many of those. But to context, I think what is the intent of this section? When I think about this element, it's an opportunity for us to sort of explain the world in which we live in today and how we see it impacting the decision we've taken around the goal and how we want the goal to be interpreted and implemented going forward. I think, Zahir, your statement as to we're in a unique opportunity this year to set something of true hope. And so I think the context provides us an opportunity to talk about what it is we saw our common task to be and the things that informed our decision making and how we want to see the NCQG taken forward in that context. So some of the things that we think would be really important to have captured in the broader context would be a reflection on the urgency of climate action and the need to deliver on all 3 long-term goals of the Paris Agreement. In that context, you could reference the outcomes of the GST, but that also could be referenced in the relevant sort of preambular component too, if we're referring back to decisions. But I think starting with a really clear statement of the urgency of climate action would be one of the most important things to have captured there. We would also want to see, of course, a recognition of our ambition to scale up financing from all sources and inputs so as to maximize scale and impact and recognize that financing needs are significant and that we have a collective ambition to lift in a collective global manner to respond to those needs. I think we would also want to see a recognition of evolving capabilities and capacities, needs, and of course, priorities. We would also like to see a recognition of the current global economic landscape as it stands today, the realities and the challenges which that landscape poses to us all. And I'm not speaking about this from any sort of bifurcated manner. I'm just thinking about the opportunity to reflect honestly about the decision around which we're making a financial goal and our reflection on what that financial landscape looks like and how this goal fits into that. And I think one other thing we would like to reflect on in the context of context is you could also think about how this interconnects then with other elements of the goal. And it's really hard to think about this in isolation, though I do appreciate that the task is to try to focus only on this. I would like to note that we would also still see context woven in through the rest of the decision text, particularly around the context which surrounds the goal itself, when we're articulating the quantum, the time frame, etc. So we would probably come back to comment on that when we get to those elements, but that's probably just some initial remarks from us. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Britt. Next, I have the EU, followed by ILAC.
Good afternoon, colleagues. To start with, we share the notion that we would have like the recalling decisions and mandates in the preambular. And then for the context, we see like, first of all, a reference to development on the climate nexus, so clearly highlighting that there are interdependencies and synergies between climate change and development objectives and to enhance co-benefits instead of trade-offs. Then we would like to see a reference to the broader financial system and finance flows. And here I would like to react to the statement made by AGN in the morning session. I think we're well aware that investment flows are currently not at scale flowing to developing countries. And we think that this goal offers the opportunity to work on that and to get the international financial system in shape to allow for more funds to flow to where it's most needed. So this would then also include like a reference to the international financial architecture reform in that context and call on other actors, just highlighting the role of MDBs, IFIs, the role of enabling conditions and those actors that come with that, like regulators, supervisors, public and private financial institutions, rating agencies, philanthropies, right, though to create the enabling conditions for the redirection of that finance flows, as well as the role of the private sector that we really need to reach that scale that we are looking into. Then we would like to refer to cooperative systemic approach, because we can only get there if we work in collaboration with multilateral funds, private capital mobilizations through enabling conditions, innovative risk-sharing instruments, and new partnerships. We would also like to see a reference to global investment needs there. And a reference to that global effort, contextualizing that global effort of the NCQG would be beneficial as a part of the context of the NCQG, and the global effort can be captured within the layering approach, speaking to different layers of finance. So there will be several elements that we see of relevance being in the context that might also be reappearing in other sections of the decisions. In addition, we should also have a reference to needs and priorities of developing countries in the context, as well as the role of NDCs and NAPs. Our last element that we would like to see in the context is impact and effectiveness, because finance is a means to an end and needs to enable climate action and policy on the ground in order to come to a long-term impact in the form of emission reductions and climate resilience. Thanks.
Thank you very much, EU. Next, I have ILAC, followed by the US.
Thank you very much. We would like to echo some of the comments that have been advanced. And yeah, it's important to also reflect the challenges and the context, as its name mentions, in which we are undertaking climate action. So just to add to the list, we would also like to see some explicit reference to those unenablers that have been mentioned across. So cost of capital, transaction costs, debt, and also like we would also support and echo like these mentions to the constraints from the financial system that are also punishing developing countries, among others. So like our addition is to take into account like these cost of capital, debt, transaction cost, unilateral measures, also very important. In this, highlight also that the needs of developing countries are evolving. So the evolving needs of, and we would for now like let it there, like because this adds up to what has been also mentioned before, like the urgency and other elements that have been previously mentioned. Thank you.
Thank you very much, ILAC. Next, I have the US, followed by Guinea.
Yes, thanks very much, Co-Chair, and appreciate all of the already very interesting and constructive suggestions from folks, which I think are really helpful and actually go a little bit beyond what we had been thinking, so already useful to reflect on some of what folks have said. To maybe start off with what our colleagues from the AGN have started with, I think we had thought about the difference between what we had expected to see in the preambular context, which was references to articles and our understanding of how the goal relates to those articles, as well as recalling of mandates and things, and the context itself, which is more specific to the goal. I think we have a couple of concrete ideas for what we would expect to see in that preambular section, where we're specifically clarifying the relationship of the goal to the Paris Agreement. I would also note that having no options throughout, so under every option, a sort of no option to include is also relevant. The reason I note that is because I've already heard a couple of references to the convention, for example, and recognizing that this is a Paris Agreement goal. I don't think we understand it as having relevance to the convention and wouldn't expect to see convention-related references in that context. But specifically, I think we would see two references in that preambular section where we're clarifying the relationship of the goal to the Paris Agreement. And this is, of course, again, in line with 14 CMA 1, where we have two paragraphs, one on each Article 2.1c and one on Article 9.3. So those two suggestions would read something to the effect of, and we're not wedded to the language, but in concept, that the NCQG aims to contribute to achieving the long-term goals of the Paris Agreement, as articulated in Article 2.1a, b, and c. And then for Article 9.3, we would note that the NCQG is voluntary for all parties and reflects a global effort in accordance with Article 9.3 of the Paris Agreement. So those would be our two suggestions to very clearly state how we see the NCQG is related to the Paris Agreement. And I think we would imagine that presumably in a preambular section. As for the context itself, and I think I agree with what folks have said, that it's useful to at least think about this as a standalone category, but I could also see it being integrated throughout the document or specifically alongside the quantitative articulation of the goal. One of the options we had come up with, and this will sound rather familiar, which is how we did it in the 100 billion goal, is to say that the goal is itself in the context of meaningful mitigation action and transparency and implementation. A repetition of that language is worth considering, and as well as thinking about how we might evolve or go beyond that. We came up with roughly 4 options of ways we might be able to innovate on that previous articulation or take it a little bit further, but I also like some of the ideas I've already heard in the room. And those other articulations of context are meant to sort of capture different aspects we see as relevant to the situation we're operating in as we were trying to pursue the goal. One would be specifically related to our aim here. So it would read something like the efforts of all parties to pursue climate action in line with a 1.5 degree climate resilient future. So very kind of objective focused. It could be very finance focused. So in the context of efforts to scale up investments in climate action from all sources, domestic and international, public and private. The context can be very focused on enablers. So it could be in the context of the efforts of all parties to take policy action to incentivize climate action, or it could be very focused on the sort of conversation we've already started to see around the evolving needs and capacities. So something in the context of the evolving needs and capacities of all parties, which I think would also be a relevant statement to include. So those are some ideas from our side, but we're looking forward to hearing what others have to put on the table as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, United States. Next, I have Guinea, followed by LMDC.
Thank you, co-facilitator chairs. I think the context should set the tone, but first recognizing that the NCQG is a continuation of the 100 billion goal discussion. And definitely we need a wake-up call to say that the long-term goal needs to be achieved, and we need accelerated, scaled-up resources that need to be provided in a very unique way. And then I think the reference to science and the carbon budget, the limited carbon budget available, we need to also underscore the significant funding gaps for developing countries, and particularly stating in the context that we unfortunately failed to meet the delivery of a 100 billion goal. And I think as our able coordinator from the Africa Group indicated, we are not starting from a vacuum. It starts with a convention, the principle of the conventions, and the relevant article of the Paris Agreement, and that are taken in there entirely. And then I think also we need to emphasize the necessity of public support as one of the key lessons learned, that the NCQG will not be an additional burden for developing countries, while recognizing that we are already financing our own actions. And I think last but not the least, that climate finance is an enabler, and there's a danger that we miss the ambition, because if the NCPG does not provide the signal, people will be, instead of increasing the ambition, decrease. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Guinea. Next, I have LMDC, followed by the Arab Group.
Thank you, Co-Chair. We align ourselves with the views expressed by the AGN and Guinea. We have 6 specific inputs on the context on the basis of the convention, agreement, and previous decisions. First, principles of the Article 2.2 of the Paris Agreement, CBDR-RC, NC, and equity. Second, chapeau of Article 2.1, poverty eradication and sustainable development. Third, Article 3 of the Paris Agreement, which guides developing countries to provide ambitious NDCs as part of the global effort to achieve Article 2 as a whole. Fourth, estimates on the needs of developing countries and references to the evolving needs of developing countries. Fifth, the lack of fulfillment of USD 100 billion goal for more than a decade. And last, Article 9 of the Paris Agreement, guiding the developed countries to provide and mobilize resources in line with the needs of developing countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much, LMDCs. Next, I have the Arab Group, followed by Samoa.
Thank you, Co-Chair. We support the ideas presented by developing countries, including the statement from AGN and LMDC and others. We want to respond to other proposals that reference the option of including references to the finance architecture or the MDBs or the private sector. We want to suggest 2 alternative options here. One, an option that clearly outlines that the NCQG is not the entirety of climate finance. It is the part that demonstrates developed countries' commitment as an option. And number 2, an option to not mention the financial architecture and MDB. So to have those 3 options there. On impact and effectiveness, we want to see an alternative option that looks at the degree to which the NCQG's delivery is aligned with NDCs and NAPs. So to measure the quality of delivery by alignment with NDCs and NAPs, rather than through KPIs or other ideas. We want to see Article 2, including the chapeau, and Article 2.2, as well as Article 3, Article 9, and of the Paris Agreement reference. And we want to see a reference to Article 4 of the Convention. An idea for Article 2 is perhaps we can recall or restate paragraph 15 of 9 CMA 3 that references it there. We need to see, as part of the context, and Guinea mentioned this, Alpha mentioned this, which is that the NCQGs is the continuation of the 100 billion goal as per 1CP21 paragraph 53. For us, we see evolving needs as a standalone item, not linked with evolving needs and capacities. So these need to be treated differently. And for us, evolving needs is linked distinctly to loss and damage. So that mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage are included. Again, we support what the LMDC mentioned in terms of the need to reflect the principles of equity and common with differentiated responsibilities. I believe ILAC also mentioned that as well. But for us, we also need to see a reference to historical responsibility from the convention. We also have to recognize that ambition in developing countries has increased. So we need to have that positive message there over the years. But we need to also acknowledge at the same side that the delivery of finance has not been commensurate by developed countries. We also need to see a message in there that while contributing the least to climate change, developing countries face the impacts disproportionately of both climate change and the response to it. It's important for us to mention that the NCQG is ambitious. We need to have positive messaging around the NCQG being ambitious and a call on developed countries to demonstrate this ambition in their commitment in the context of the next NDC update. We support the AGM's proposal to focus on sustainable development and poverty eradication, and their suggestion to focus on Article 4.5. And on 4.5, we want to mention an element specifically that has a message that says that despite Article 4.5, developing countries have been paying for their own climate action. This includes both financially, but also paying for the costs associated with loss and damage, as well as response measures. We also need to have a section that references the USD 100 billion, the failure of delivery in 2020 and subsequent years, and also the disagreements over the progress of the delivery of the goal due to different climate finance definitions. We want to have a section, and we can work on it together as a group, that talks about lessons learned, and we can explore some of the lessons learned together. We want to also have a reflection on the undelivered amounts of the USD 100 billion over the years, how much they would total. And we support ILAC's focus as well on cost of capital, transaction costs, and unilateral measures. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Arab Group. Next, I have Samoa, followed by Switzerland.
Thanks a lot, Madam Co-Chair. So I think one of the main grounding principles that we do want to reaffirm is that the new goal itself has to reflect urgency, the urgency that we need to achieve the Paris Agreement objectives, and especially accelerating efforts to the more ambitious part of 2.1A, which is 1.5 and limiting to 1.5. Like this should be that this goal is sort of the key catalyst, so that it may be controversial, but we put to the recesses of our mind this well below 2 aspect. If it's about to being ambitious, and I'm happy to hear the Arab Group stating, about it kind of fueling ambition. This means that if we do get the NCQG right and we get the funding, we need to keep everything below 1.5 within this critical decade. So it's quite important to have that, as well as to look at the resilience building that needs to be done as well in that context. Also recognizing that climate finance enables developing country parties to respond to climate change in line with objectives of the regime and their needs and priorities arising in that regard. right? And so that contextualization of the needs and priorities are within the context of the regime, and achieving the objectives of the regime are extremely important. And so grounding that there. Other things that we want to kind of reflect and see is that the need for consideration and adoption of certain principles to guide the implementation of the NCQG, which will focus on concepts from both Paris as well as the convention. So things like accessibility, we've been highlighting that nonstop, and we do need to see that reflected as a principle in itself and then operationalize it further down according to your input paper. Ambition and how we deal with that. And we know that there are many interesting proposals on how we reflect ambition. And we look forward to as well engaging on how that can be done, because again, it's linked back to achieving 1.5 within this critical decade, as in the limitation of warming to that. Effectiveness, and then the last thing is predictability. The goal is a tool of predictability. And then so that is a key understanding that principle has to be linked to the goal. So just those 4 principles to kind of highlight. There needs to be an understanding, and many have talked about it, and I think the European Union might have spoken to it a bit, is that understanding that climate finance is a means to a targeted end, right? And so it's distinct in nature, and that it's codified as new and additional financing. There should be, ideally, a world in which that we, a century down the road, do not need climate finance. I'm telling you, if we need climate finance in 2100, we're up a creek without a paddle, okay? And so I think understanding that and grounding that climate finance is specific to achieving these objectives in line with the deadlines that we have in the Paris Agreement and the objectives is quite crucial. The other thing would be the systemic disenablers that we keep on highlighting to colleagues that we face as developing countries: the cost of capital, the transaction cost for access, and the unilateral measures. Those things do need to be discussed to have a more broader discussion on how developing countries can engage with other types of capital financing and achieve our needs and priorities. And the last thing is the importance of evolving needs. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Samoa. I assume speaking on behalf of AOSIS. Next, I have Switzerland, followed by China, and then the LDCs.
Thank you very much, Co-Chair. Many elements resonating that have been said. So recalling past, in the preamble section, recalling past decisions, Article 9.3, 2.1c. Similar to others, we wouldn't see reference to COP decisions beyond the CP21 decision that specifically speaks to the goal, and references to the convention, since this is a CMA decision in our understanding. Regarding the context, many things have been mentioned that resonate, like recognition of evolving needs and capacities, changing economic circumstances, or the recognition of needs to effectively implement Article 2.1a(2c), which are the overarching goals in our understanding of the Paris Agreement that we aim to achieve. There's a very good reference we've done in the past, in one of the past decisions, paragraph 15, 9 CMA 3. I'm not sure if the Arab group actually pointed to that decision as well, but that's would be a good basis, I think, to reference that. We're also happy to discuss with others references to the financial architecture reform, etc. I think the EU called it the roots of the tree. Happy to engage with you on that. And fully on the same page as I think AOSIS with the urgency reference 1.5 that's also mentioned in that paragraph 15 9 CMA 3, which we would want to see, and the impact orientation, as well as the principle of effectiveness, which I think is key to be referred here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Switzerland. China is next, followed by the LDCs, and then Canada.
Thank you, Fiona. Firstly, I want to echo the intervention made by AGN, LDC, Arab Group, like LDC and AOSIS, and all the developing countries. First, The second thing that is we'd like to see a live stream for this ad hoc working program. Maybe not today, maybe in the future, but we'd like to see that. Regarding on the context, we would like to see the full, exact the same decision that we recalling because we see tweak of words not only here, but not only in the submission of developed country and also from the website. The background of this particular agenda item, the language they use in the website is not exactly the same as in the decision. So we want to see that. And also, we want to add more such as the historical history, not history, the past decision, where the two CP15 paragraph 8, where is Copenhagen the accord and regarding on the 100 billion, we want to see that in the context. Furthermore, I want to share something that is being you know, I just cannot believe that some of the countries say there's no obligation and this voluntary for all parties because just it's crazy, you know. The NCQG is a CMA agenda item and must follow every provision of the Paris Agreement, including 9.1, which developed countries have the obligation to provide financial support. Furthermore, as stated in the Paris Agreement, Paris Agreement is in pursuit of the objective of the convention and being guided by its principle, including the principle of CBDR, RC, and in light of different nation circumstances. And the third point I want to say is I'm keeping hearing the terminology that is really not in line with the Paris Agreement. For example, in the Paris Agreement, which is a developed country and developing country, and we are not pleased to witness developed countries self-glorifying themselves by using the term contributor. Developed countries are the one who pollute the world for over 200 years and bear the obligation to provide financial support to address the issue they caused. Maybe using another terminology is more appropriate, such as obligator or just And furthermore, we are not pleased to label as a recipient, as we have been suffered from the impact of climate change caused by the historical emission by developed countries. The situation not only limit our right to develop, but also affect the food security and eradication of poverty. It is high time developed countries deliver on their promises and agreements they ratified back home. Thank you.
Thank you very much, China. Next, I have the LDCs, followed by Canada and then the UK.
Thank you very much, Co-Chair. In the morning, I did highlight a few elements under this context, but just to reiterate some of the aspects for our group, it is important to recall the decisions, some of the decisions and articles in writing, especially Article 4 of the Convention, paragraph 52 and 53 of the Decision 1 CP21, Article 2 and 9 of the Paris Agreement. Of course, we are quite flexible. If this is more suitable to going into preamble, then that's fine for us. But it is important that we recall these. In the context, referencing the current science is very important because that it highlights the urgency for climate action. This is important for us. Similarly, in the morning, I did mention about taking into account the decision of the global stocktake. We say this because it captures the learning from the 100 billion goal. It does reference to the challenges in access and quality of climate finance. It also recognizes the finance gap and needs, which is also estimated in the GST decision. Similarly, recognizing the importance of just transition and resilience building is important. Promotion of sustainable development and eradication of poverty in developing countries also needs to be referenced. Of course, this is the objective of the Paris Agreement. Clearly, recognizing the needs and priorities of developing countries is crucial. And of course, it refers to mostly in the NDCs, NAPs, and LTS. But we also like to highlight the evolving needs, which is primarily focused on the loss and damage. Of course, this is also, again, the decision from the COP28. And finally, referencing to the recognizing the special needs of LDCs and SIDS would be crucial for us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, the LDCs. Next, I have Canada, followed by the UK. I also recognise that there are some who have put their flags up for a second time. If you would please allow us to get through to those colleagues who haven't yet spoken on this issue before coming to you. Thank you. So UK, over to you. Oh, no, sorry, Canada and then the UK.
Wow. Okay. Thanks, co-chair. I think the context paragraph is really is that it's the context. So it needs to reflect the true context that we're in, which is clearly different than the context that we were in 2015 and when we wrote the Paris Agreement and agreed to it. So I agree with the US's suggestion that there shouldn't be references to the convention. I think Switzerland also raised this. It doesn't make sense in this context. It's a goal under the Paris Agreement. But I'd also agree with or be open to Australia's suggestion that you move all of the preambular sections to like all of the paragraphs to a preambular section. And coming back to this idea of there being a change from 2015, countries have clearly evolved, needs have evolved, capabilities have evolved, and the context needs to reflect that. And so there should be options on the table to reflect evolving capabilities, but also evolving needs as well as capabilities. And in that vein, I'm not opposed to the suggestion by the Arab Group and the LMDCs about having the reference to CBDRRC, but clearly that's in the context of evolving respective capabilities. And I think that's all tied together, that countries' GNIs have changed, countries' needs have changed, countries' emissions have changed. And so all of this needs to be taken together. That will also be as important part for important context for the new contributor base, which includes the transparency component for new contributors who had not been part of the former Annex 2 group. I'd also think that in this context, it will be important to reference that the 100 billion goal was met as a means to moving forward to a new goal. A separate part, but an interlinked part of this climate crisis that we have is also a biodiversity crisis. And so acknowledging the various crises that are ongoing simultaneously will be important. We also, a few have mentioned, but the urgent need to respond to climate change will be important to address. And I think that coincides with the purpose of the new collective quantified goal. The goal is being set to address climate change. It's being set to address the goals listed in the Paris Agreement, Articles 2.1a, b, and c. So in reference to Articles 2.1a and b, I'd like to see a link between the finance provided and mobilized and outcomes in the recipient countries. And in that sense, the impact is key. And then in reference to Article 2.1c, there should also be a contextual factor of changing the financial sector, changing the whole of economy. It's a global economy approach to adequately address climate change. Similarly to the US, we'd like to see a reference to the global context of all actors working together, including a call to action for the private sector, MDBs, to make sure that we leverage every opportunity to incentivize change. And lastly, this is about ensuring that the NCQG is anchored in the current reality to make sure that it's relevant to all actors who should contribute to ambition on finance. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Canada. I'm sorry for skipping over you. Lando crosses them off and I think we're done, but we're not. Next, I have the UK followed by Brazil.
Thanks very much, Co-Chair. I'll start by saying that for the UK, the context and preamble are also complementary. So I'll largely stick to the context, but noting that this is on the basis of clear elements included in the preamble. So I think very similarly to what others have said, the preamble must be clear on the mandate. I'd echo my colleague from Australia and also Switzerland, who have already run through the specific relevant mandates here. As others have said, the goal is under the Paris Agreement, and our mandate clearly sets the goal in the context of Article 9.3 of the Paris Agreement. That goal aims at contributing to the accelerating of the achievement of Article 2 with a baseline of the 100 billion. Sorry, that was the goal. Without this clarity, we will struggle to agree the ambition needed within the goal to deliver against needs. We consider that the context could both be standalone element and embedded within the goal, we consider the context could be both standalone and embedded as appropriate throughout the goal. And we can be flexible on this. We would want to see a long-term vision outlined in the goal, which we have referred to within our previous intervention as our guiding star. The goal should support efforts of holding the increase in the global average temperature to well below 2 degrees and pursue efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees, as well as recognising the impacts these efforts would have, including reducing the risks of climate change, increasing ability to adapt and foster climate resilience, and make flows consistent with a pathway to climate resilient development. I would also echo my colleague from IOSIS on the sense of urgency being reflected within the goal. What is key to recognise within the goal is the context of the lessons learned from the 100 billion. Within NDCs, it is recognised that some needs are to be met by domestic finance, some by private finance. We want the NCQG to take into account this broad approach in the delivery against needs, noting the importance of a public finance core. We have heard interventions from a number of contributing parties, emphasising our clear role and the role we see ourselves playing in contributing to the goal and scaling up our delivery. The UK doesn't see this as a question, but the question is about whether the question is not about whether these groups will contribute, but how we can maximise public finance provided within the goal, something we have clearly heard as a priority and must be a central outcome. Recognition of the importance of wider sources of finance is outlined in our CMA5 decision. We should seek to build on this progress, including reference to the role the goal can play to support the implementation of processes including NDCs, NAPs, as well as the importance of the goal increasing and accelerating ambition and reflecting the evolving needs of developing country parties. I would also echo the EU in their emphasis of the importance of IFI reform and the role the MDBs can play. Thank you.
Thank you very much, United Kingdom. Next, I have Brazil, followed by New Zealand.
Thank you, Co-Chair. Let me begin by stating that we align ourselves with the statement made by my colleague Martin for Group Sul. We celebrate the inclusion of Paraguay in our group, and this is our first intervention as Group Sul ever. We are open then, if you want to join. You just need to change a little bit your positions, but we'll be glad to have you in a group. With regard reacting specifically on those 2 points, the preamble and the context, we would start the decision by setting the legal framework for the NCQG, which is clearly both the convention and its Paris Agreement, including the whole of Article 2, CBDRC, and the different responsibilities under Article 9. Regarding the context, we also would start this by with a strong call for action, for urgent action, and also recalling the IPCC assessment that highlights that there's a need for enhanced ambition in this critical decade. We would finally mention also the outcomes of the GST, which sets the picture of where we are now and where we should be heading. We would mention the evolving needs of developing countries, the lessons learned from the 100 billion goal, including the need to have a better understanding on the quality of climate finance, as well as having a clear definition on what should not be counted as such. We would also recognize the need to scale up grant-based and concessional financing for developing countries, as well as for capacity building activities, technology development, and transfer. We would also include the recognition that enhanced support for developing countries will allow for higher ambition in directions and not the other way around. Finally, we would have a strong call for the reform of the MDBs and the financial system, and also the need to tackle the unenablers of private capital flows. Thank you, Co-Chair.
Thank you very much, Brazil. Next, I have New Zealand.
Thanks very much, co-chairs. Lots of good points already made already. So we'll just touch on a few very, very briefly. We'd support the context reference to the urgency of action that I think was highlighted nicely by Samoa on behalf of AOSIS and the critical importance of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees. Support the link to the kind of connection with the biodiversity crisis and how those intersect as raised by Canada. Essential to have a reference to the evolving needs and priorities of developing countries, along with the capacities of parties to contribute as part of the global effort. Critical to have reference to access. I'm open to options on how to frame this, but the need to overcome the challenge of access, particularly for LDCs and SIDS to climate finance, is critical. I think Australia also made a really good point that we have the context section, but building on the previous section about interlinkages, holding space for some weaving of contextual elements throughout the decision will be really important. We'd be happy to talk more about mandates and articles, but I really am over that. So we'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thanks very much, New Zealand. I have three, one party and two groups asking for the floor again. I assume this is to share more ideas on the context. It could also be that you want to reflect. Very happy to hear all of your interventions, but I do note that we're quite keen to move on as well. As I outlined at the start of this session, we have a lot of elements to get through and we really want to hear as many ideas as possible. So, I'm sure you want to engage robustly with each other. I also encourage you to do that outside of the room as well. So first I have the AGN, followed by the US and then the Arab group.
Thank you so much, co-chairs. But as an icebreaker, so I still have this wild card, so I can come back and add. So just to for anybody as icebreaker, you can come back again. So not be banned from doing so. I think in the first intervention of the AGN, we set the scene and in terms of the elements, the preambular part. But I think as colleagues have mentioned in their interventions, there was a context, and the context is very clearly what we have now. And as colleagues have mentioned, the realities on the ground and the realities have to be reflected very clearly that we are facing a finance gap and that the current MDCs are not funded and that loss and damage is not being funded and that adaptation, we have a clear adaptation gap. And again, this is a very important thing that although we fully support the collaborative system approach, but yet we are facing unilateral measures that are really hampering the ability of developing countries to provide more finance and really move forward on that. So this is another element that I think should be included in addition to the gaps that I mentioned. With that, I haven't seen that we have agreed on changing the CBDR-RC to CBDR-ERC. So until we do that, we are sticking to the CBDR-RC as is. And I think we should go in this direction. We are not in support to framing the NCQG as a 2-1C approach or to bring the biodiversity support within or the biodiversity framework within this framework for now. My last point is that we need also, in reflecting the realities on the ground, we need to reflect that there is a huge gap in climate finance. and there is no shortage of public finance, because we are seeing very clearly, as was mentioned by colleagues in the previous session, that public finance is not short. We are seeing hundreds and of billions of dollars going for specific things, be it domestic support, subsidies, be it agricultural subsidies or others, be it allocation for supporting other countries in wars and stuff like that. So we are not short of public support. I think this also should be reflected, that while climate finance is facing a challenge from public sources, yet public resources are available if there is a political will to deliver on that. So I think this is also very important part to be captured in the framing, as was mentioned by colleagues, or the context as was mentioned by colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you very much, AGN. Next, I have the United States.
Yes, thanks very much, Co-Chair, and apologies for coming back, but just wanted to kind of come in and explain maybe a little bit better some of the things we had previously suggested. I think it's rare to be called both optimistic and crazy in the same day, so appreciating the need to maybe be clear about what our suggestions are and maybe to take people through them in a little bit more detail. Before I go ahead and do that, though, I did also want to respond to Mo's comment just now about the need for really shifting financial flows and recognizing that there is sufficient global capital to make sure that we're responding to the needs of that are presented by the climate crisis. And I recall that the most recent IPCC AR6 synthesis report made very clear that there is indeed sufficient global capital in the financial system to respond to the climate crisis, but it is currently misallocated, and that we need to really be focusing on shifting those financial flows to where they need to go and away from the sectors which are actively detracting from our goals. So I think we'd be very supportive of reflecting that kind of shifting in this goal here. To maybe take us back to the comment I had previously made about the relationship between the NCQG and Article 9.3, and in particular the voluntary nature. Just maybe sort of walk people through that explanation to be clear about what we're proposing and the basis for that. And I know that we had a chance to talk about this as well on the TED over the last couple of days, and I'd be really happy to sit down with folks and also explain it further if useful, and as well as get our lawyer on the phone who's very strict about these types of interpretations. But our understanding of this is that, again, we have decided in the past that the NCQG is going to be in accordance with Article 9.3 of the Paris Agreement. And Article 9.3, as we all know, says, as part of a global effort, developed countries should is not a shall provision, and therefore it is not an obligation. There's a difference between shall and should, and that is the legal basis for how we understand the Paris Agreement. And I think from our perspective, it really is as simple as that. This is not a shall provision, and I think we're very interested in continuing to engage in good faith as part of this process. We are not objecting to whether or not there are obligations as part of Article 9.1, which talks about how developed countries shall continue to provide support for developing countries in continuation of their existing obligations under the convention. I don't think anybody in this room thinks that the NCQG is under the convention, given that we had not yet set the goal yet, right? We're in the process of setting the goal now. How could this be in continuation of an existing obligation? That's sort of not how we understand that relationship here. So to be very clear, we continue to support and fully stand by the importance of Article 9.1 and Article 9.2, which makes reference to those obligations from the convention. That's not something that we dispute. But again, the NCQG specifically is related to Article 9.3, which is a should provision rather than a shall provision, and recognizes the importance of a global effort. So in our view, and frankly, I think this is more than a view and much more is a legal read of what we've all agreed to here, is that the NCQG is indeed a voluntary goal. It is a voluntary commitment for all those who choose to contribute to it. And we're looking forward to discussing with others in that spirit, just to explain what we had meant by that. Thanks.
Thank you very much, the United States. Now I have the Arab group.
Thank you, Co-Chair. We just wanted to give our 2 cents on some of the debates going on. I think there might be a little bit of a confusion on the relationship between the Paris Agreement and the Convention, and I think the best way to avoid this confusion is to recall 1 CP 21 paragraph 1, which is the adoption of the Paris Agreement. And I think doing that perhaps can contextualize the discussion and solve some of the questions that we may have, and we don't have to interpret it. We can just state it verbatim as it is. We wanted to just comment on a few ideas. On Article 9.3, we agree that goal is in the context of Article 9.3 that's in the mandate, but we have to understand that when it comes to law, there's the precedent is incredibly important. And want to mention that the USD 100 billion goal was also in the context of 9.3. And every report on this earth, every discussion we've had, every workshop we've had, there's unequivocal consensus that the 100 billion goal applied to the Annex 2 countries. Every report there includes Annex 2 countries. So it's a continuation of that goal, which was under 9.3 and still is under 9.3. So the legal precedent is there. We've had decisions, for example, long-term finance decisions that also explain this. Cite reports, climate finance delivery plans, estimations from developed countries that mention Annex 2 countries as being responsible for this goal in the context of 9.3. So just wanted to add our 2 cents there. And in terms of context, we do want to see, I mean, it seems that countries around the table are interested in GHG emissions. And for us as a group, this is something we could entertain. Perhaps we could take a look at historical cumulative GHG emissions and put that on the table. And we guarantee you that the perceptions will not match the numbers. We're pretty much comfortable with that approach as long as it has the full context of climate change, which goes back to the 1700s and the Industrial Revolution. I can guarantee you that none of the 22 Arab states of our group were undergoing industrialization during that time. So we just want to make sure that the context is fair. We have historical responsibility laid out pretty clearly, and we're happy to entertain ideas such as GHG emissions as long as it shows the full picture. We can go along with that, just to clarify. Thank you.
Thank you very much to the Arab group. And we just have Japan who is online. So Japan, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, I would like to echo the statement made by the US that the NCQG is to be set in accordance with Article 9.3 of this agreement. That article makes clear that investing in climate action is a global effort, and it is crucial that the NCQG reflect that and take into account the effort of all parties which are contributing to financial climate action. Article 9.3 also does not create any obligation or mandate for quantified goal to exist or for any individual parties to contribute to such goal if one were to be set. In that context, the NCQG is voluntary for all parties. In that sense, the new goal should have an overarching investment layer, which includes all relevant financial flows, public and private, domestic and international, response to growing financial needs, and sends a clear signal to global finance actors. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Japan, and thank you for staying up all night to be with us as well. Lastly, I have China.
I will be very brief. Just want to remind everybody in this room the live stream is on, so be aware that. And second things I want to say is I want to remind everybody that the world hasn't changed since 2015, not even since 1992. Besides, Paris Agreement kick in 2021, and it hasn't changed. And as I know, the Article 6 is still not active until now. So I don't know where you get that idea from. Thank you.
Thank you very much, China, and for reminding us that the live stream is on. I better fix my hair. Thank you, colleagues, for that really fruitful round of interventions on the context. And I know some of you also touched on the preamble as well in the relationship between the two. I propose to close the speakers list there on this issue, and that we move to transparency. The reason we are jumping around a little bit is also just to give you comfort that we're not prejudging the structure, so we're just jumping around with the elements. But we have about 45 minutes left, and I'd like to hear Zahir and I would like to hear a round of interventions on the transparency elements, noting, of course, that it is very closely tied with time frame. It's one of these interlinkages that was discussed yesterday. So please don't feel constrained that you have to only stick to time frame. If you see linkages between time frame and something else, another element, please make that known in your intervention, including how you see that those linkages reflected in the structure as well. So with that, I open the floor to hear interventions on the transparency elements. Sorry, I couldn't see you. Brazil.
Thank you, Co-Chair. Just a quick reaction. For us, the transparency issue, it's more linked with the quality of what we are reporting than necessarily on how many reports are we going to receive. And this is clearly a matter of the definition. Again, I'll come back to this point. The question of the definition of climate finance. For us, transparency means that we will have a clear picture of what is being funded, what is being, where is the resources flowing, and the quality of those resources. The matter of the period of reporting for us is, of course, important. It should be linked with the other processes of the Paris Agreement, including the GST, the NDCs. For us, the NCQG as a whole is a way to prepare parties for the following round of the NDCs. The level of ambition of the NCQG sets the bar for the ambition that we want to see on the NDCs. So these two processes are linked in our view. And so the reporting of the implementation of the NCQG should bear in mind the process of the NDCs and the GST. But more than that, we are concerned about the quality of how we are reporting, what we are reporting. And I think this should be dealt under this issue. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brazil. Next, I have the AGN, followed by Switzerland.
Thank you so much. And I agree with Brazil on the issue of definitions. It is a very important component, and either it should be included here to highlight that we have a challenge in relation to definitions, or it should be also put in the context at the beginning of the decision. Second point, we already have a process under the Paris Agreement on communication and reporting, which is every 2 years we have developed countries communicating what they will be provided in the next 2 years, and then every 2 years they also do the reporting on what has been provided. So we already have a process in place that talks about a 2-year time frame. So this is the first one. The second one, we also have created processes, and we like creating processes in this process for GST follow-up and other elements follow-up, including reports coming from the Standing Committee on Finance. And I think all of those processes, NCQG should be factored in as one of the main elements to enhance the transparency of the delivery of this of the new quantified goal. Having said that, again, our view as AGN that we have a 5 years under the current NDCs and NAPs. And within the transparency process, we have to provide a full report from the contributors, so developed countries contributing by 2030 on the delivery of the goal that we agree to. This in addition to the regular biannual reporting process. The second element relates to do we enhance or not enhance the existing ETF? I think this will be based on what we agree in the context of the new quantified goal, be it a goal, goals, sub-goals, different teams, groupings, and so on and so forth. This will be reflected in a way in the update of the ETF system that we are having. Third point, it is important to differentiate between transparency and accountability. And that's what we mentioned before. And we believe that it is very much needed now, as colleagues have mentioned, as per the evolving nature of what we have now, to have two elements. One is a burden sharing mechanism between the developed countries, and this will allow for the transparency and the accountability part. And the second one will be like a benefiting sharing process or criteria that would allow all developing countries to benefit, making sure that everybody is going to be part of that and really reflecting on the NDCs and the NAPs. So those are two very important elements in, again, enhancing the transparency and highlighting the accountability. Accountability is a very important element because currently one of the lessons learned from the 100 billion is that some developed countries have mentioned and have confirmed, as per the reports that we have, they have delivered their so-called fair share based on their own criteria, and others have not. So individual accountability is very important here because this will allow us, like in the NDCs, each country is presenting its own delivery of its NDCs. Similarly, each country, developed country, should be presenting its own delivery of its share or its allocation or the share of the NCQG. So those are the main points that we want to highlight. Maybe colleagues from the African group will augment, especially those who are working on the transparency part. And let me just highlight that in doing so, it is important that we are fixing the process based on the reporting and communication processes that we have created, and not based on different budget cycles in developed countries. We know that some countries have 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, and we cannot just try to find something that would accommodate all of them. We have a system here, and we know that they do report in details on what is provided, what is mobilized, what is even the investments coming from their own private sector. And this is being done in organizations that are not within the UNFCCC. But we know also that the Standing Committee on Finance is taking a lot of responsibilities in bringing this to the UNFCCC. So just wanted to highlight this last point. Thank you.
Thank you very much, the AGN. I have Switzerland now, followed by Kenya.
Thank you very much, Co-Chair. So on transparency, actually many things that AGN just mentioned, we could probably sign up to, so it's good. There seems to be some convergence emerging. Let's see what others are saying. So on the time frame for the tracking progress reporting transparency scheme, fully aligned. Yes, we have this biannual setup that already exists under the Paris Agreement. We clearly see that to be the crucial link. ETF Article 9.5 submissions you were mentioning. Then with regards to the goal is a collective goal. So in addition to these individual country reportings, we see the collective tracking progress. And I think AGN was also referring to that. So we do see a role for a collective tracking progress, and some options in the co-chair's summary from last year. There was a reference to the SEF. We're open to discuss that option. Then on the recognition of elements beyond the ETF, yes, we recognize that, and we're also in alignment with the AGN there that this will depend on what the goal looks like, what additional elements we need to see there, and they could be integrated in the ETF provision in 2028, and they could also be taken into account through additional sources of information, similarly to how the SCF is dealing with that at the moment. So you have like additional sources of information that you take into account for those aspects which are not covered in countries' ETF reports. Accountability versus transparency, also that hear that echoing. We want to see accountability for all contributors. And you heard us on the contributor base, recognizing the diverse positions there, but we need to see accountability for all contributors and not just one group of countries that is considered contributing. And you heard our link there of who we consider to be part of that group. And then we also would like to see a link to outcomes here. We have agreed to various outcomes on a global scale in the context of the GST. There's GGA framework outcomes. We're hoping to get ambitious outcomes under the mitigation work program as well. And we could see a reference here in the transparency section of how the goal supports the implementation towards these outcome goals. So we also have an outcome metric being tracked in the tracking progress, or outcome metrics, and not just a money figure. We feel that would be important as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Switzerland. Next, I have Kenya, followed by Saudi Arabia.
Thank you, Co-Chair. Since it's the first time I'm taking the floor, allow me to congratulate you for your reappointment, and also to sympathize with you for the work ahead. It's not going to be easy based on the first few hours we've had so far, but I believe and trust that we are going to deliver this by the time we are in Baku. On transparency, we want to associate ourselves with what has already been highlighted by Egypt on behalf of the African group, that indicate that that is sort of the comprehensive view of how we look at the transparency arrangement. We know very well that the goal is not outside the action process. It's part of the bigger picture of what has already been negotiated. So we already have a very strong action package, and we already see a call for the next round of NDCs, which would sort of also communicate what the outlook will look like beyond 2030. So we see that the transparency arrangement, building on, of course, what Brazil also highlighted, on a common understanding of what climate finance is. One of the challenges we already anticipate in the current transparency arrangement is the different definitions that will underline or underpin some of the figures that every country will be providing in their reports. And this is going to be a problem because we are going to be tracking apples and bananas in the same manner, and it's really going to be a challenge if we are going to do an actual tracking of whatever quantum we are going to end up with. So we need to start thinking what our common understanding of climate finance will be in the context of the new goal. It's important also to point out that we understand in the context of Article 2 that we are all working towards a common mitigation and adaptation goals, and all developing countries in highlighting their needs and priorities communicate these through their NDCs, their NAPs, and track evolving needs through their different reports, biannual transparency reports, adaptation communications, among others. It's important to align the goal and the transparency of the goal in line with those action and strategic documents that communicate evolving needs and priorities, which the goal is supposed to finance. That, of course, also points to the fact that the 9.5 reports will be quite critical in demonstrating the commitment of developed countries and the developing countries, of course, who will have reported if they want to. Of course, they're not obliged to report 9.5 reports, but that is a very key instrument for demonstrating the commitment biennially for what developed countries want to provide in the context of the new goal. Article 9.7, of course, has been elaborated extensively in some of the tools we've put in place under Decision 5 CMA3. I recall a number of us in this room were participated in the negotiation of that decision. And some, of course, countries that are now keen on reviewing were also very troubled by some of the things that we needed to include in that. So I'm still wondering what additional information we would want to provide. And we were very clear that we shouldn't increase the burden on reporting and focus our work on reporting as opposed to action. So we would want to just caution us just in regards to what additional would we want to include in that arrangement. For me, it covers almost everything, all the instruments I can imagine. As far as climate financing is concerned, are already accommodated therein. So that for me provides a very strong basis for what our transparency arrangement should look like. It's also important to recognize that the GST together with the SCF process provides a very strong framing for reviewing the goal in 5-year cycles, because one of the rationales behind having the global stocktake process is for collective assessment of progress. And we had a whole pillar on MOI that is basically supposed to do that. So I also see that as a pathway for doing collective assessment of progress together with the SCF processes, which is why having an annual goal within a 5-year temporal scope is something that we are quite keen on, so that we are not having something that goes beyond the action mandate that is expected to demonstrate ambition over time. So for us, that is something that is very important. I'll stop there for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kenya. Next, I have Saudi Arabia, followed by Samoa.
Thank you, Madam Co-Chair, for giving me the floor. On a first note, Saudi Arabia is speaking on behalf of its national capacity. We fully align with the Arab Group statement, which covered transparency in their intervention, and we support also the interventions made by Brazil and AGN. We, the Arab Group, also in their statement and in our national capacity, we have advocated for transparency arrangements that are in line with our principles and that respect the multilaterally agreed decisions of the past few years. We set the ETF as the backward-looking reporting tool without any changes, taking into account that it has very clear modalities, procedures, and guidelines for developed countries that touch on issues that are key for all developing countries. These include how to avoid double counting, how to accurately report mobilized finance, how support enables the implementations of indices, NAPs, and other national plans, and also how finance is new and additional and represents a progression over time. Climate finance is distinct from official development assistance, ODA, and humanitarian aid. While the latter two may address climate-related elements, we need to avoid double counting within these categories by ensuring amounts reported as climate finance reflect the climate-specific portion of support, rather than the entire allocation, non-climate and climate-related. Such support, when classified as climate-specific, should be based on the national needs and priorities. The national climate plans determine the climate specificity of support provided and mobilized. For forward-looking reporting, we respected Article 9.5, just like we respect the entirety of Article 9. We recognize the biannual reports need to improve and will push for improvements in predictability in the appropriate avenues and discussions. For reports on progress, we prefer the Standing Committee on Finance to continue its work and recognize the need of improvements in their outputs. These improvements cannot be separated from an update of this SCF operational definition of climate finance and the work that our group pushed for and secured in Dubai. On a final note, Saudi Arabia believes that the update on the ATF before 2028 is a red line, and we want like to make that clear for all parties. And also, we support AGN on the note of burden sharing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Saudi Arabia. I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 speakers still on the list, and we are 4:07. I encourage you to keep your interventions brief if you can. If we can't get through the transparency elements, we'll have to take it up in the morning. I think it's preferable if we can finish it today, but we do have to finish at 4:30. So if we can, let's try and squeeze it in by 4:30 and we can start afresh tomorrow on the qualitative elements. But first I have Samoa, followed by the US and then LMDC.
Thanks, Madam Co-Chair. So on the transparency and accountability arrangements, simply put, it's what counts towards the NCQG or what can't count towards the NCQG, and how do you keep those who are supposed to be providing accountable for what they're providing to developing countries. Similar to what Saudi Arabia highlighted, we've said it since for a while now, but in our 2022 submission, that climate finance is distinct and therefore additional to current and future development finance flows. So that's ODA and humanitarian finance. And I just want to unpack why we've reached that decision. It's not that we don't like development finance. It's not like we don't like humanitarian finance. It's quite simple that finance that uses ODA eligibility requirements for access cannot be climate finance from a justice perspective. The reason being is that, first of all, we haven't established that as being an eligibility criteria, and using ODA eligibility criteria locks out close to a third of our constituency as smaller and developing states. And so as a result, this shifts the costs of responding to climate change to those least responsible, most vulnerable, with the least capacity, while alleviating those who, the developed countries, and their legal obligations on the Convention on the Paris Agreement. And I think we need to come to some sort of grips and address this issue of ODA. And we've tried it in multiple forums with the OECD DAC. Yeah, that happened. And nothing really went forward there. So we really need to unpack why this additionality bit is very important to smaller and developing states from that perspective. Next is a definition of concessionality. A definition of concessionality is very important in the context of the definition of climate finance. And the reason for that is to ensure that and I think highlighted by other groups, you do not have instruments instruments and different financing that essentially you can get elsewhere, right? And essentially, you have many different individuals continuously sort of profiting off of the issue and the problem of climate change. Again, it's linked to the concept of justice and why is it and how is it fair to provide this type of financing without having an understanding of minimum levels of things like grace periods for repayment, preferential maturity dates, different sort of clauses for force majeure. And so if these instruments and these financial instruments are provided without these minimum levels of concessionality, how can we in good conscience consider it to be climate finance? Next is on the transparency arrangement, and many have highlighted the issues on the MPGs and making sure that we follow the MPGs and the ETF, as well to note that there needs to be a clear understanding that we use the BTRs of not only the developed countries that articulate support provided and mobilized, but now we have the unique opportunity for developing countries that are providing their reports to report on the support received. Now, this gives us an opportunity to actually challenge a lot of what has been said and what has been provided by those developed countries who provide, and say whether or not what is the actualized money that lands on the ground in the recipient countries. And so that we need to figure out how do we reconcile those things, noting again that there may be mismatches in timelines when the reports are submitted, etc. But it provides us with a unique opportunity for going just beyond one side of the story and having both sides of the story in the context of transparency. The other things that I'd highlight, because again, I'm sitting down here, and all the intervention that I've made so far has just been reiterating our 2022 submission, and so we really fleshed this out, and we hope that everybody can as well continue to progress in this forum, so that we can actually make some progress on these different things. So I think at the end I'll probably just stop there. I think I'm really tired and also extremely hot. So thanks a lot, Co-Chair.
Thank you very much for that, Samoa. Next, I have the US, followed by LMDCs, and then the United Kingdom.
Yes, thanks very much, Co-Chair, and I appreciate the constructive discussion that we've been having thus far, the transparency arrangements for the goal, which I think has been productive, and it feels like we're moving in a good direction broadly on this conversation. Maybe just to say at the top about this conversation on climate finance definitions, I think we really hear and understand the importance of that call and the need for more clarity on the types of climate finance folks are providing. I am a little skeptical that that's something this particular venue is going to be able to solve or address. This is something that at least we as the United States have engaged in conversations on as part of the Standing Committee on Finance, and we continue to be really interested in having conversations about what is and is not climate finance. For example, in our national definition of climate finance, we've explicitly excluded direct expenditures on fossil fuels, and we've got a lot of other really interesting examples of things that we see as contributing to climate finance across a variety of contexts. So those types of activity-based definitions, I think, are really interesting and important. And if we were able to get agreement on something like that, I think it would be really useful and really transformative. But I fear the SCF has been unable to do that for quite some time now, and it's not clear to me that we're going to be able to do that in this context. So I might suggest not necessarily focusing on that and allowing us to continue to use that nationally determined approach to the Paris Agreement and recognizing that countries are setting their own definitions rather than focusing on that aspect here. With regard to the transparency arrangements for the new goal and sort of the more relevant aspects of this conversation, one of the things that we've found helpful as we've started to think through this issue are differentiating between, on one hand, data collection and data compilation, so sort of data issues, as well as on the other hand, like review and revision of the goal, which are separate and kind of distinct matters. So on data collection and what we're actually sort of going to be collecting from parties, this is obviously very much linked to the wider conversations that we're going to have on the goal itself. I think as we continue to discuss what the features of the goal are going to be, what are the layers, what are the elements, quantitative and qualitative, that is then going to direct the kind of information that we're going to need to collect as part of those transparency arrangements. So there's a very strong linkage there. There's a couple of options that I think we see as relevant for the data collection process. One, and I think it's worth just sort of putting this on the table as a first order of business, is there's a real opportunity there, I think, for contributors to determine what those arrangements would be and to kind of decide what the right indicators would be for the information they're providing. I think that's a reasonable way forward on that. We could also consider designing a bespoke transparency structure for the NCQG. That seems like an awful lot of work and very likely to reinvent the wheel in some cases, and particularly for things like the Enhanced Transparency Framework, where we already have a number of those relevant features. And then the last is, of course, to rely on the Enhanced Transparency Framework. But I think our expectation is that the goal will be quite distinct and go quite a bit beyond only the provision and mobilization of support, and therefore that the ETF will be on its own insufficient to really report on progress toward the goal. So we would need to, in that case, see a really significant update to the Enhanced Transparency Framework to reflect the outcomes of these discussions. And I think we'd be willing to discuss when that might happen. Is that something that happens immediately during this year, during this process? Is it something that happens immediately after we've decided on the goal? Is it something that happens in a couple of years as part of that regular review cycle? But I think if we were to go down an ETF route, we would need to see some really significant changes to it to make sure we were capturing all of the information that we needed to have. So that's just the information collection side of things. What do we do with it once we have it? most of us, I think, seem to be talking about some sort of a compilation or report of some kind and some document that says, well, how have we done? How do we synthesize that? How do we bring that all together? Again, I think one reasonable option is that the contributors to the goal could certainly determine that. That's kind of been the mode of practice for many years under the 100 billion goal. The contributors have worked in particular with the OECD to produce a report to put their best foot forward and say how they had gotten together and thought they had made progress toward it. I think that's a strong option. You have an opportunity to use potentially existing reports under the SCF. I've heard some mention of biennial assessment, and frankly, I think the biennial assessment's current structure is fairly reflective of the multi-layered approach that many of us have been discussing. There's a whole section on wider global investment flows, as well as a big section on support. So there's some real opportunities there. Or I think we'd be open to considering the SCF doing a new bespoke report, although I think we would probably not be terribly in favor of that, given it is likely to be highly redundant of the BA in our view, and probably not necessary in that context. Then you have your review and your revision conversation. So we're considering review of at what stage do we take a look back and see how we've made progress toward the goal. That I think is something that really much depends on what the time frame of the goal is. It also depends very much on the type of information that we're going to have and when. So depending on the ramp up period of the goal, when data is submitted, what the data time lags are, when we would expect to see that. So I think we're fairly open on that conversation. I think we've been toying with a variety of time frames, sort of maybe around 10-ish years might make sense, but I think we're open and flexible to have discussions about that. That I think from our perspective is distinct from the concept of revision, which is to change the goal. And I think that's something that at this stage we're actually not interested at all in. It seems a little bit strange to us to be having a conversation about determining the NCQG, to be building this framework, this structure, which we hope is enduring and creates an architecture under the Paris Agreement to have these conversations about finance going forward. And I think to already sort of preempt now that would need to be changed is sort of unusual to us. So I think we're really not anticipating having a revision of the goal in any context. But I think it also needs to be said that if we were to have such a revision, I think it would be that all of the elements would need to be on the table and all of those things would need to be revised together, given that there are so many interlinkages between these processes and these discussions. So if there were to be a revision, it would need to be of all of the respective elements of the goal. So those are some of the aspects we've been thinking about in this context. Thank you.
Thank you very much, United States. Next, I have the LMDCs, followed by the UK and then Guinea.
Thank you, Co-Chair. We support the interventions made by Brazil, ASEAN, Saudi Arabia, Samoa, and other developing country colleagues. We believe that a mix of short-term timeframes, allowing for a combination of annual targets and cumulative targets, will enable us to take care of any shortfalls in the delivery of the funds, and also the evolving needs of developing countries. Also, ex-ante reporting on how much developed countries will provide as part of the existing arrangements under Article 9.5 will be very helpful. This should be complemented by an ex-ante burden sharing mechanism between the developed countries. Processes such as the SCF report on NDR will be important to take care of the evolving needs of developing countries. And lastly, climate finance definition is highly relevant in this context. Coupled with the ETF, the definition will allow for more trust in the accounting of climate finance flows under the new goal. This will entail not counting ODAs, non-concessional flows, and non-climate specific flows as climate finance under the NCQG. We do not agree that there is a nationally determined approach as far as the definition is considered, as there are clear mandates under the convention and its agreement. For instance, Article 9 clearly specifies that developed countries need to provide and mobilize finance to support developing countries. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, LMDCs, and thank you for being brief. I have the United Kingdom, followed by Guinea.
Thank you, Co-Chair. I'll also do my best to be brief, but would first like to emphasise how pleased I am that we're making the space to discuss the transparency element of the goal today. From the discussions in recent months, we've seen convergence on how to address transparency with the goal, and the UK sees this as a clear area to make early progress. It is clear that we should be using existing mechanisms and therefore the ETF as the backbone of the goal's transparency arrangements. The ETF has been designed to speak to key policy considerations, which will be included across the goal. We must, however, recognise that we don't know what these considerations will be yet, and it is possible that elements covered within the goal will go beyond the scope of the ETF. And as such, we must note that further consideration of any additional transparency arrangements will need to be considered, depending on what the final goal covers. This ambiguity should not stop us from seeking early consensus on the role of the ETF as the backbone of transparency arrangements within the goal. I'd finally like to refer to some challenges that we have heard relating to transparency arrangements under the 100 billion goal, including relating to the quality of reporting. We recognise this, and we see the ETF as a clear step in implementing a more robust and transparent process that will address many of these concerns, including shedding more light on the accounting methodologies used. And it is because of this that we consider it to have such a crucial role. We are open to continuing this conversation to ensure true buy-in into the NCQG's transparency arrangements. Thank you.
Thank you very much, UK. Next, I have Guinea, followed by the LDCs.
Thank you, Co-Chair. And I would like to associate my statement to the statement made by Ambassador Mo on behalf of Africa Group. And I will say that there is a linkages, and there might be a linkages between transparency arrangement and other elements. And hence, I think a discussion on transparency at this point of time are subject of different discussion that are happening in other part of the structure of the text. So for us, this transparency is very important for ensuring that NDC is translated into tangible improvement in light of climate impact. And I would like to approach in two ways. First, I think despite the fact that we have an enhanced transparency framework under the convention, we need to strengthen the accountability, and that there should be prerequisite for that. Colleagues mentioned burden sharing, benefit sharing, but we also know the shortcoming of the current CTF. There is no loss and damage there. The different constitutionality level are voluntary. So the question is, should we wait until 2028, or should we use the NCQG to make strong statement and call upon, at least during that period, that country are encouraged to provide the different and granular information? And we also think we need additional process. And I'm very happy to hear from many developing countries making reference to the N9.5. And I think there should be an ex ante and ex post process oriented to provide key sources of information on the progress, because we are having a time frame of 5 years, and we do not want to repeat the case that after 5 years we say there is a likelihood that we meet. And I think the 9.5 should be actually reoriented to be in light of the NCQG. And one of the elements we think in terms of accountability will be to look at whether we cannot learn from the international assessment and review, and the multilateral assessment that will allow countries in their biennial assessment, in their biennial information communication, that there are concrete, this time quantified numbers there, and then the ministerial dialogue being converted in an engagement to understand and help country to get more sense of predictability of the resources that they plan through the 9.5, and there is a next ante part of that, and as well as the next post part. Definitely, I think we need a space where we can question the progress made and help us understand what we are doing, because the experience have shown that there's no comparability, no consistency. Even countries that are being reporting and being, presented as a good students have sometimes, backwards movement. So we need to have a level of comparabilities in terms of underlying information that countries will be providing, but also to have a sense of consistency in light of enhancing this process and the transparency framework under the NCQG. Having said that, I think also we need to to consider the transparency part. It is obvious that for different financial instruments, different additional requirement will be needed. One will be the mobilization goal. The mobilization goal, the NCQ, the ETF, myself was involved in the negotiation of the CTF. I know how limited it is, and it can be that a country provide resources to MDBs and say that it doesn't have any control about the inflow or the outflow. And I think that exercise will help us because there is a strong call and a strong reliance on partners like MDBs. We need to understand these processes. And I think I'm not expecting that this happen overnight, but the accountability mechanism that allow for multilateral consideration and assessment and questioning will help us to move on that direction. I will stop there. Thank you for your.
Thank you very much, Guinea. I have the LDCs, ILAC, Australia, Canada, and the EU, and we will finish for today. So LDCs.
Thank you, Fiona. Like as I stressed in the morning for LDCs, the definition of climate finance is very key. It not only helps in transparency and looking at the additionality of ODA and etc., but it will clearly tell us what climate finance is financing. But at the same time, it will also tell us what we should not be financing. I just want to put a context here that why we stress so much on this, because there was recently a report. You could see that one of the MDBs funded an international chain hotel in an LDC country and called it a climate finance. While clearly the need is for energy poverty, addressing food insecurity, natural disaster, climate-induced disasters, among others. Where should our priority really be when you talk about climate finance? I think that's the reason why we've been highlighting so much that this needs to be really considered. Of course, as I said in the morning, the time frame is quite short for us to probably agree by the end of this year in the definition of climate finance. But probably we could agree process ahead that at least by the end of next year, something that the definition will be agreed. And we're quite flexible in terms of having a very concrete definition. Probably just the elements of what outlines what needs to be financed or what should not be financed. I think that is very key for us to know. Similarly, a review of the goal to update the NCQG based on the time frame would be necessary. This is also why we mentioned this is if the adequate amount of mitigation actions are not taken, then that has a huge burden on the adaptation and loss and damage. I think that needs to be taken into account, and flexibility is extremely needed when that context arises. Similarly, my final point on the making the ETF fit for purpose in relation to the outcome of NCQG will be very crucial. We say this because the current BTRs and ETF is reliant on information to primarily finance, provided, and mobilize, not to actors outside the convention. It also does not, excludes capturing loss and damage work. That's why NCQG should establish its own arrangements for source of information, frequency of reporting, etc. But probably SCF could be the right entity or responsible entity in taking this ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much, LDC. Next, I have ILAC.
Thank you, co-chair. And then this is my first time taking the floor, so I will congratulate you both. Also, thank the Secretariat. Thank my fellow ILAC country, Colombia, for hosting us. I know, Sophia, we had suffered many a days of gastritis trying to coordinate this event, but thank you for that. And speaking on transparency, I think there's like Gabby, I think there's a lot of convergence on how transparency sort of lands within the NCQG, so that's encouraging. But I think going into the aspect of how do we ensure that it's actually transparent, right? And I think that speaks to the lack of a definition of climate finance, and how do we then ensure that we avoid double counting and all these different aspects that then it makes it harder for us to actually keep track of what is actually being financed or called climate finance within the new goal. So that's important for us to bear in mind. And if we want to look at it as in different aspects of it being predictable, additional, and new, then I think that there are different elements that will maybe try to ensure that those different aspects. And definitely the ETF in the backward looking aspect of, are we delivering on this additionality and this new element of what is actually being delivered? But I guess some elements will definitely depend on what the goal actually looks like and different elements that are included. But maybe if when we include loss and damage, then I guess maybe a reference as to how that would then have to modify or tweak the CTFs before the next round of BTRs, let's say. So to include the different elements that might be included and not wait until 2028 to make these changes that might be needed to reflect or to keep track of these elements that are included in the goal. And then definitely when the ETF review comes in 2028, then I guess it would take into account, we would sort of have need a mention as to if we see then that the ETF has to be reviewed in any aspect to take into account the final structure of the NCQG, then that has to sort of be ingrained as well by now in the decision as of now. Recognize as well the role of the SCF and the different reports, and whether or not current reports are just sort of migrate into whatever would then be fit for purpose for the NCQG. I think that's also to consider as for the SCF. And I would not be doing any justice to the glamour item, my fellow co-chair, if I do not bring up the biennial communications under 9.5. These will be very, very important to include, and sort of that element of predictability in the delivery of the public provision part of the goal. So taking that into account. And then the other is other elements of transparency inputs that will depend on other elements of on the final structure of the NCQG, elements that might not be necessarily reflected within the ETF. I think we'll have to wait until the end to see how those are included, definitely in transparency arrangements. And perhaps because a note here from my fellow colleague from Colombia, in our initial intervention that she made this morning, in the aspects of context, some of the principles that we also want to see reflected within the context segment is the issues of climate justice, mentions the just transition, and the fact that the NCQG shouldn't be focused on or structured on the fact that it should be non-debt inducing for developing countries. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I have Australia, followed by Canada, followed by the EU.
Thank you. I know we're getting close to time, so I'm going to try and keep it brief. I agree with much of what many people have said about using the ETF as a backbone for the transparency arrangements and building as much as possible on the bones of what we already have. There's an enormous architecture for transparency under the Paris Agreement already, and we should seek to utilize that rather than build it from scratch. I think there was a helpful distinction made by the US on the difference between data collection and data compilation, and I might try and structure my intervention around that, recognizing that everything in this goal is interlinked and it's hard to speak with great specificity until you know what the structure of the goal will look like, etc. But I'll be as precise as I can be. With respect to collection, I would see the ETF being the primary mechanism for data collection, just recognizing that it does provide us with our most up-to-date, standardized, comprehensive, and peer-reviewed data collection framework under the Paris Agreement. In due course, I would see there to be a need to update the CTFs to reflect the outcome, and as Raju said, to make it fit for purpose for the nature of the goal that we've set. It's hard to articulate what those specific changes would need to be yet. Elena, I think you made an interesting point, is you could maybe surgically say that we're going to update things early. Another option could be, if we know that there are changes we want to make and we want to encourage early reporting, is we could make a call for voluntary reporting on particular elements without actually changing the CTF until we have the opportunity to do that under the ETF review in its standard review cycles. That's another opportunity there to reflect on an urgency and a desire to have inputs earlier and sooner. I think that in the data collection component of this decision, it's really important that we also articulate how we will account for international public finance flows not currently under mandatory reporting, and ensure that we continue to capture data for finance provided and mobilised by sort of 3 groups at least: current providers who report finance officially already, current public finance from providers who don't currently report officially, and public finance from new contributors as well. With respect to compilation, we're very open to the role of the SEF being used in this context, and would sort of agree with statements made by many around this room that we must consider how this would sit with existing reports. And the BA makes a lot of sense in this context for us to be sort of leveraging and building upon, as it does capture much of both the support and international financial flows, which many of us have been talking about in the structure of the goal. I agree with many things which have been said with respect to tracking outcome delivery, and I think the transparency element of this should reflect on how it is we intend to track outcomes, particularly those expressed outcomes in the GST, the GGA framework, the mitigation work program, as well as any other elements relevant to measuring impact and effectiveness. And I note here we should again try and use the bones of existing processes, so that stand on the shoulders of existing indicators that already exist, rather than trying to reinvent the wheel as much as we possibly can. I'm very open to a conversation as to the language we could include in this section on avoiding double counting. I think we hear that that's a point of concern, and we'd be very happy to address that in this section. Certainly our seat is. And then I think with respect to thinking about how this could include review or not, I think an option could be no standalone review, but consideration in this element of the document on how the NCQG can be assessed and reflect upon under existing processes which already exist, including the GST, as well as other processes under the Paris architecture. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Australia. I now have Canada and then the EU.
Thank you very much, Co-Chair. So when I was thinking about transparency, I was trying to think about why, what its purpose is in the final text. And I think big picture, it's where is finance flowing, to whom and by whom, and to what impact it has. So is it effective? What are the results? So with that in mind, I think many people have already said that there's some consensus around using the existing ETF. I know that people negotiated long and hard to have that, and the BTRs being open for everyone to use to report is a really effective way forward. And since BTRs allow for parties to report on both finance provided, mobilized, as well as finance needed, it can be a framework that we can use to reflect capabilities and vulnerabilities in a dynamic way. And my co-fearless leader, mi pareja, already spoke about the glamour item. And so I would be remiss not to mention Article 9.5. I've never heard so much support and love for 9.5 as I have in this room. And I can only assume it's because Elena and I did a wonderful job at Koppen and Bonn. And so we, of course, would encourage the continued use of Article 9.5, and we'd like to see that in the decision text as well. And as a reminder that Article 9.5 is not only to be used by those who have currently used it. Anybody who contributes climate finance is welcome to use Article 9.5 submissions to demonstrate their ambition and their climate leadership. And we'd encourage others to continue to do so. Article 9.5 can also be used to provide information on actions to facilitate the flow of climate finance and alignment in a qualitative way. This will also provide transparency on the other layers of the goal that seem more elusive, such as Article 2.1c and domestic finance. beyond the ETF, I agree with Switzerland, and I believe AGN also said that this could be incorporated. Any changes could be incorporated in 2028, based on a few years of experience in the new goal and seeing what else is needed. We echo the US as well on the SCF that the biennial assessment is a conducive way to track progress on a multi-layered goal, because it already captures private finance flows for climate action, for example. Similar to Switzerland, we'd like to see outcomes and results on climate finance being included in the final text. And so this could be under transparency, but it doesn't have to be, depending on where it fits. But we'd like to see how finance is used in responding to Articles 2.1a, b, and then the broader layer of finance in Article 2.1c. And then I also want to be clear that a revision is different from a review. A review is a check-in. And I think that the OECD's reports that they've been doing biannually and in the last few years annually have been a really good. I'm sorry, I just feel like not everybody's listening. It would be great to have everybody listen.
If you need to have a conversation, can I kindly ask that you do that outside? I'm having a hard time listening to Kelly.
Thanks, Fiona. I wanted to be clear that a review is different from a revision, and we see a review as a check-in. And that's something, for example, that the OECD has done annually in the last few years and biannually before that. And we really appreciate the reports that they put out, and they have helped influence our own research and our own climate finance commitments. And so we're very supportive of continuing those reviews, and I hope that the OECD would do so in the future. A revision, however, is different, and what I understand it to be is establishing a cycle of creating new goals, which is not something that we can agree to. I also heard the AGN's point of view on burden sharing, and as usual, I'm very happy to talk about anything that's proposed by my friend Mo. But before we could incorporate a burden sharing into the text, we'd need to establish who is in the contributor base and who is in the recipient base. And therefore, we'd like to see a no burden sharing option as well in the text. And then I'd also like to underscore my understanding of the LDC's and ILAC's call for a climate finance definition. I totally understand where you're coming from and understand the concerns about double counting, and I'm happy, similar to Australia, to have those conversations. What's a challenge is that the Paris Agreement is bottom up, and so by nature, those kind of a definition on climate finance isn't possible in the structure that we have. But I think that having the structure of the operational and definition within the SCF is a useful alternative. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Canada. And last, I have the European Union.
Thank you very much. I'll try to be brief, noting we're already over time. Like many others have already said in the room, we do also see the ETF as the backbone of transparency arrangements, together with the BTRs and complemented as well with reporting such as the biannual assessments. We do acknowledge that the ETF will probably not cover all relevant elements of the NCQG from the outset, noting, however, that there are options for or space for voluntary reporting already. Also, current ETF MPGs already foresee that all of those countries who are providing climate finance should report on it. This would, in our view, increase transparency while encouraging and enabling as well a coordinated, complementary, and more catalytic action. Speaking to the review of the ETF, we see the upcoming review in 2028 to provide the opportunity maybe for updating the ETF in manners that address any potential elements not adequately covered. And of course, as was conveyed by a number of different colleagues already, that it would be pertaining to the final composition, the final context, and the elements of the goal, of course. One of such important elements includes capturing impact and effectiveness. We would also acknowledge the importance of additional data providers in this respect and consider building on the rich experiences and the quality of these data when looking into the review of the ETF. We acknowledge the value of the work of the Standing Committee on Finance, and we foresee a continued role as well for the SCF in this respect. I wish to also echo the points just made now by Kelly on the difference between review and revision, and also align ourselves with the view that she expressed, that we do not see an inclusion of a revision in the NCQG. Lastly, speaking to interlinkages, we would like to flag especially the time frame in regards to the transparency arrangements. It's relevant not least in terms of availability of data, but also the timing of the 2028 review of the ETF, which in our view speaks for a time frame of 10 years. Another linkage will be on sources of finance and strengthening our ability to track climate finance flows. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, the European Union, and apologies, I didn't see you there. The Arab group to finish us off.
Thank you. And if everyone focuses, I promise I'll do it in 30 seconds. If everyone focuses, conditional support. So I just wanted to comment on the biennial assessment, and I think it's a good example, reflection of the multi-layer and what would be in store for us developing countries if we go for a multi-layer. The biennial assessment has now had 5 editions. We're working on the 6th one. And every single time it says we can't provide an estimate because everyone uses a different climate finance definition. So we would be essentially relegating the NCQG to a signal that we send that we can't track, and we're not sure how we're going to enforce, which is why our group doesn't support the multi-layer option. One last thing, I broke my promise, but one last thing on the climate finance definitions. I think the Paris Agreement is bottom up in terms of NDCs, but it has top-down requirements. Some of them, such as reporting, is a requirement. Climate finance provision from developed countries is a requirement. So that's our stance on that. So these 2 points are linked to each other. Thank you, and I hope everyone can enjoy. Now we have a G77 meeting, so we won't be able to relax just yet, but we're almost there.
Well, I hope you're able to relax soon. Thank you very much for that, Arab group. That concludes the speakers list for today. Thank you so much for sharing all of your views and ideas and suggestions. And also, you know, the reflection on other parties and groups' interventions as well. We really do appreciate it. Thank you very much for your constructive and active engagement throughout today. Just before we close, some quick announcements. So the plan for tomorrow is that we will cover some of the remaining key elements in no particular order. We'll cover the quantitative elements, the qualitative, and some of the cross-cutting elements as well. So that's for tomorrow. And we start at 10 a.m. So appreciate if colleagues can be on time. There is also an announcement from Sophia. So I will pass over to you.
Thank you very much. So seeing that it is also important not only to see biodiversity, but also music diversity, especially in Colombia, which is a country full of rhythms. We would like to suggest to go tonight to Andrés Carneres Cartagena. So this is a place very local. There is capacity for all, so you're all invited, like, to come. All those that come before 7:30 don't have to pay entry. Those that comes after, well, they will. Just for you to know. Encouragement. So we hope that you have your dancing shoes, best energy to dance merengue, salsa, vallenato, reggaeton, and all those others, cumbia, and so on. So yeah, hope to see you all there today.
Thank you so much, Sophia. I have a question. Is this live streamed like this? Just joking. And Zahir just has an announcement as well. If you could just hold on 1 minute, please, colleagues. Won't be long.
Colleagues, now it can be long. It won't be live streamed, but if you watch my Instagram or Facebook, you might see a feed of it, as was with the TC in Dominican Republic. Seeing that Ricardo this morning said he's missing the icebreaker stuff, I'll leave you with a trivia history question thing. You can figure out if it's true or not. And I was inspired by this morning's interaction between Ben and Grupo Sur. I don't know if many of you know from history that in 1963, before it became formally known as the G77, it was called the G75. And in 1963, the G75 was preparing for the first UNCTAD meeting. As part of the G75, there were two countries that were part of the G75. One is my co-chair's country here, Australia, and the other country was New Zealand. And in fact, in 1963, New Zealand also signed the Joint Declaration of Developing Countries. However, subsequently in 1964, both Australia and New Zealand withdrew, and 4 more developing countries joined, which became the G77 and China. So you can go and check it whether I'm lying or it's true, and let me know tomorrow. Good night, everybody.
Thank you very much, everyone. There are some refreshments outside if you would like, near where we had the coffee break, if you need some refreshments. And drink lots of water. It's very hot. See you tomorrow, everyone, or this evening.